Canfax is pleased to present Matt Makens, who's a meteorologist from Colorado with over 20 years of experience in communicating about weather trends and data. Matt has been providing quarterly Canadian weather outlooks over the last year for Canfax, and the March issue is available in the members only section of the Canfax website if you're looking for more information, and I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Brenna. Thank you, everyone. Last year was a great discussion, and I left some questions unanswered just due to time. Never feel like you can't reach out and ask a question. That's critical. So let's plan on doing that, and I'll give you my contact at the end if there's not further questions or time for questions. So I'll share my screen, and we'll just get right to it. I don't want to waste anybody's time. So we'll get talking here on the spring and summer outlook for sure, and then we're going to talk about what we're looking at for fall. The critical thing here as we go throughout this presentation is we need to reset our stage. La Nina is done. What does that mean for the rest of this year? And that's going to be the focus of this conversation, and why we even care about La Nina or El Nino in our neck of the woods. So we'll be going through that as we go throughout this presentation. And that is the biggest topic. What does this change of the year ahead mean, not only for Canada, but across the entire industry? Cattle, cereal grains, corn, all that stuff. What's going on globally and locally for the year ahead? La Nina used to be a great snow producer. It was kind of classically for Canada, La Nina, we're going to get dumped with snow. We certainly have had the cold. I don't think over the last 20 years or so, it's fair to say that La Nina is much of a snow producer. At times, yes. At other times, no. The recent La Nina obviously brought the traditional cold, but also a lot of that associated drought issues that we've had. And we're going to be breaking out of that drought as we go throughout this forecast. So some good news there. Now, historically, western and central parts of the country, they're not, greatly impacted by El Nino, but they do have the highest impact of El Nino. And that's classically during the winter and the spring. We normally get milder than normal winters and springs also. For Eastern Canada, there are impacts, but mostly tied to what the hurricanes do in the Atlantic. Are they overly active? And usually El Nino tends to limit that activity. So say for the Maritimes, for example, looking at this year and perhaps the subsequent year, 2024, 2025, perhaps a lower than normal hurricane season will have impacts there. But usually El Nino is going to be an impactor for the industry as a whole, but for Canada, mostly central and western. Now, what has La Nina done to the global industry? We've really seen such a huge change in cattle and cereal grains over the last couple of years due to this La Nina, which was historic in terms of duration and strength. What regions should be on our radar for crop and cattle production? Last year, Brazil came out with headlines and the corn prices went all over the place because we were worried about the Brazil crop. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with the near and long-term forecast for the country. So La Nina is done. That may come with some cheers for folks, especially in the prairies. And we need to kind of couch this in what is La Nina? What is El Nino? Why does it matter? That's a bottom line issue for us. The graphic ahead of you on the top is the same as the bottom representation. And I've colorized the ocean temperatures at the very surface. Warmer than average is red, cooler than average is going to be in the blue. The top image was earlier this year. That was mid to late January. And then the bottom image, the larger one, is current. I just ran that. Now, what you see in those black boxes right along the equator, kind of in the center of both images, that's where we look for El Nino or La Nina. The biggest change was La Nina, the blue colors, early this year was rampant, still incredibly strong. But a rapid changeover has happened, and we've begun to move in with these warmer ocean conditions here. La Nina is done. La Nina not likely come back for quite some time. So we're looking at, just over the last 4 months, a tremendous change in the ocean conditions. Also a tremendous change off our west coast, not only in Canada, but the US and Mexico. Much colder ocean here. Both these will have a big impact on us. And why? The seasons, by changing how the earth tilts around the sun, that's our seasons. That's the biggest driver of climate. Number two is El Nino or La Nina as the biggest drivers of climate. And it's important because if that ocean in that one area is cooler than average, it's storm free, and it impacts storm progression downstream. If that area of ocean is warm, like it's leaning toward now, it creates storminess there. And that begins to create storminess elsewhere. So the atmosphere loves to be in a balance. So if we add storms here, we take storms away from over there, and vice versa. And La Nina, that cold ocean, by taking storms away from there, we've also largely taken them away from North America, Brazil, Argentina, Europe, Canada, the prairies. We take the storms away from there. So by reversing that trend, we start to bring storminess back and improve our moisture outlook. So another way to look at it is what has happened to the country since La Nina started. So the image on the top left, that is the La Nina starting point. Not exactly, but close to it. So that's early in 2020. And that's the drought image. And we have the beneficial waters that we had out over the east, very saturated ground, lots and lots of water. The prairies were break even. They were right at average overall. And then we get into the Peace region and out into BC and wetter than average. That's how we started this La Nina. The result of La Nina is shown down here in the bottom right. The lack of storm systems created by that cooler ocean so far away has been the drought problem. And now we've expanded the drought from BC, Peace region, down through the prairies. We're still doing okay out to the east, don't get me wrong, but the surplus, if you will, has also dropped. Now, the drought just isn't a local problem. We started to see drought issues emerge in Asia and India, Africa, all these nations that kind of tie into our corn industry and our cattle industry. So as you look at drought, not just across Canada present day, which is bad across the prairies in BC, Peace region, down through North America into Mexico, the image here is showing you the drought across the country, across the globe, excuse me. And this is as a result of La Nina being in control. It's not just a Canadian problem, North American problem. It's a South American problem, a Europe problem. We're taking water away from a lot of places. Now, as La Nina fades this year, these drought issues become less extreme. So for the industry as a whole, a global industry, we're going to see a major shift in crop production areas and also the cattle industry. You can look at drought, as I just showed you, over a long term, and that was looking at drought conditions with streams, ponds, lakes, reservoirs, all that kind of storage. But how has it impacted vegetation? Across the Northern Hemisphere, we're kind of gearing up for growing season. Southern Hemisphere is into their second crop. So where is this vegetation healthy and where is it not so healthy? So the colorized images that will follow, if an area is healthy, you're going to see colorations in the greens, the blues, into the deep blues. If a vegetation is not healthy, where there's going to be tremendous losses, you're going to be looking at the oranges and the pinks and the reds. Let's look at South America. This same town hall a year ago, we were having major issues with corn throughout South America. The two images you see, one on the left is present, the one on the right was last year. And there's more reds on the one on the right, implying a poorer crop last year, poorer vegetative health. We had corn issues last year. Not to say that their crops are perfect this year, but the vegetation by and large is healthier. But that's for Brazil. From Bolivia to Argentina, it is a poorer vegetation than last year. The crop is not good there at all. Most vegetation in Brazil is better than a year ago, but the entire continent as a whole is kind of break even though Brazil has increased. And what's their outlook? What's the rest of this secondary corn crop going to be like for South America? Well, also cotton too, but mostly focusing on corn here. We've already seen a reduced amount of moisture and also very warm temperatures there. So the forecast going forward is a lot of dryness for Brazil. That's going to impact that secondary crop. we may begin to see that price change in corn futures based on just how dry Brazil is for their secondary crop. There will be no improvement for Uruguay and Argentina. It's just not going to happen. Their drought continues. There's really not much of a crop, and that crop is not going to get any better. So cattle there, the farther south you go, is really going to be greatly impacted by ongoing drought. Now let's talk about Europe. Last year, we had a lot of drought in Europe and a lot of snow, and that impacted wheat and corn prices. It has improved this year versus last, and the same idea. This year's on the left, last year's on the right. Much improvement throughout Germany. Quite a bit of France is doing better now than it was last year. But Spain and Portugal, as we go forward, they've been battling drought, and that drought does continue. Their forecast, so the start, really, if you will, of their growing season is kind of on a mixed note. To the west, Western Europe is not going to favor so well. Eastern Europe, and I'm not going to get, the geopolitical situation is totally different for Ukraine, but they're going to be favorable for crop production. Bottom line here is that Europe should have a better grain situation than last year. Obviously, that may have some global impact for pricing. Get into Australia, and I always talk about Australia because of molasses as that food supplement, that food additive. What's going on with molasses? Well, last year, there was quite a bit of drought across Australia. La Nina gives them lots of water. So on the left, all those plants, sugarcane, very healthy. And in fact, they had too much water in some cases. But La Nina does the opposite to Australia that it does to us. It gives them lots of water. And going forward for Australia, really the moisture is going to begin to get quite limited. And the sugarcane production area is right in here. If you can follow my highlighter, eastern areas and northeastern areas primarily, that's the sugarcane production area, and that's molasses. As we go forward and El Nino kicks in, drought. That's a problem for sugarcane. That may drive up the price of molasses as we go late this year, next year, into the following year. So that's another little tidbit there. Coming in North America, our plant health remains very, very poor from central to southern plains, southward into Mexico, as well as the Tennessee Valley. And again, current day is on the left, last year was on the right. So a lot of our prairies, a lot of our corn region has shown some improvement of late, but the biggest improvement for the states and for Mexico too has been the west. The farther west you go, lots and lots of water. That's not really going to be a corn area, obviously, but it is a hay producing area, alfalfa and whatnot. The biggest issue for the states and Mexico is the corn futures will be much better, much more optimistic this year, because the conditions continue to improve in the Ohio, the Tennessee valleys, into the Corn Belt. Last year, it was not a good outlook. Corn planting was way down, but this year, USDA, we have higher numbers, stronger numbers for corn, and that's because the outlook is more favorable for much of the Corn Belt. But the recovery for the Central Plains and the South will be very, very slow. Any pasture, any wheat, any corn, any cattle feeders that are from the Central Plains, which is Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, plains of New Mexico, into Texas, into Mexico, our ground honestly is awful. It's just terrible. And we don't have a good moisture situation to recover. So that's going to be, that's a huge cattle area. That's going to be a factor going for the rest of this year. As many of us improve, some of the huge feeders and cow-calf operators in the heart of the states just are not liking the outlook. We're not recovering quickly enough, and our grass is awful. So with that said, La Nina has been a huge impact on us, obviously, over the last couple of years. What is El Nino's future here? If El Nino can kick in quickly, we're going to see a much more rapid change in this global picture and a picture for the states. We're going to improve those huge cattle feeding areas for the states if we kick in El Nino quickly enough. I'm showing you back to those sea surface temperature maps and why this is critical, because you're going to hear multiple things from multiple sources the rest of this year about El Nino. And not to say good or bad, I'm just trying to explain it to you now what those things are going to be, those topics that you'll hear or read. Shown here, again, are the sea surface temperatures, warmer or colder than average. And we're looking in these boxes, these 3 black boxes. There's really 4, but we're not going to get into that. But within these boxes, that's where we look to define El Nino or La Nina. El Nino and La Nina are not atmospheric weather things. They're ocean temperatures that in turn change our atmosphere. So within these boxes, La Nina is gone. El Nino is growing. Red's moving in here. That's the warmer ocean. Warmer ocean's taking over this area. That's going to be the talking point. You're going to see forecasts for El Nino that are very rapid, very strong El Nino projected by even May. That's 1 month from now. Projections are shown here. For this one area, the highlighted boxes we talked about, what are the ocean conditions, not atmosphere, ocean conditions going to be like as we go forward in time? These across the bottom, those are your 3-month seasons. So for example, March, April, May, June, May, June, July, and so forth. As we get into summer, this red bar that you see, that represents El Nino, the probability of El Nino being in the ocean conditions in the boxes above. That's greater than 60%. July, August, September. Now the probability of El Nino is over 80% and remains more than 80% likely for the remainder of the year. That's what these charts mean, and they're representing the ocean conditions. So for El Nino, there's a greater than 70 to 80% likelihood of those conditions starting this summer and lasting the rest of the year. But I caution you, when you hear these things, those will be the headlines. That will be the grabber for you. El Nino is present, but that does not mean our weather will respond. We're talking about the oceans. El Nino, La Nina, that's an ocean thing, not an atmospheric thing. Now, the oceans, as we talked about, do create kind of storminess downstream. It can take time. So as you listen to forecasts about El Nino being present here or coming in the next month, that forecast is telling you the oceans will. It's not a forecast of the atmosphere, only the sea surface. It may take time. You know, it could be delayed by months for the atmosphere to respond to that new ocean condition and find a new balance. The oceans and the atmosphere, they do like to work together, but they don't have to do it like clockwork. One changes, takes a while for the other to change. So yes, technically, we may be in El Nino next month or even June or July, whenever it decides to kick in. It'll be soon, but the atmosphere may not immediately respond. So what's our takeaway? What does this mean for us? How quickly can the atmosphere respond? Well, I'm only going to look at the atmosphere now. So I'm looking at years where the atmosphere began to behave just like the oceans dictate. Were they behaving La Nina or El Nino? So the speed of this transition for our weather pattern across Canada, to me, it's looking more and more like 1996 to 1997. And I'm not going to really get into this chart, but this is the period right here, the shorter transition. This is representing El Nino or La Nina within the atmosphere. And this bright column you see here, which is narrow, that was 96 and 97. And that was a transition from a relatively decent La Nina, and within a few months, El Nino kicked in, and the atmosphere almost immediately responded. Now, there's another period of time, which is more recent, 2013 to 2015 represented here. And just notice the colorations, they're more spread out. It was a slower transition in 2013 to 2015. It took a couple of years to get us into a strong El Nino. And if you remember that period of time, it took a very, very long time to resaturate and regrow things. And not just in Canada, but the whole cattle industry as a whole, There was a long delay in improving cattle conditions 2013 to 2015, largely tied to the weather situation of taking so long. But again, I think our transition is more like 96 to 97, much more rapid. We'll see a quicker change of pace, not only for weather, for crop conditions, pasture conditions, and total head count will be much more rapid of a change than what we had just about 10 years ago to this date. So I hope that gives you some perspective on the difference between what we're talking about with El Nino just being in the oceans, technically the textbook definition, versus what happens in the atmosphere. So how do we apply this going forward? Now we're going to discuss, and the rest of my time is all forecast and how I forecast. So to build a forecast, yes, there's computer modeling and simulations, but those can be greatly limited, especially this time of the year. Their skill scores right now for computer modeling in March and April are really horrendous, really very poor skill scores. So if you've been reading my texts that I've been sending to Canfax and are on the website, I base things on history. What have we seen before? How do we apply that going forward? So the image on the left is still those ocean conditions, but I've identified areas that are of great interest that can drive our climate. It's not just El Nino or La Nina, it's other ocean areas. Around New Zealand is a critical one for us. To the west of Australia is another one. The Pacific, anywhere west of Hawaii, out toward Asia and the Pacific, conditions there are critical for us. Critical will be the Central Pacific, which has been so warm, and now we have a tremendous cold ocean from BC all the way down to the Baja of California. All of these critical areas I examine, almost put under a microscope, if you will, because they are sources or sinks of energy to give storms up above. They change the storm pattern across the globe. And the atmosphere does things too. So I analyze the atmosphere. This image is just showing you waves and literal waves. Just like you think of ocean waves, atmosphere is a fluid. There are waves within the atmosphere. So I dissect the atmosphere at about 10,000 feet above the ground and look for these dominating waves. Just like wave crests when you look at the beach, look at the ocean. Same thing in the atmosphere. There are dominating positions of those, and that's what I've identified there. Then it goes even farther. I identify our pattern, not only just the ocean, not just the atmosphere, but other connections. Similar snow cover years, similar Arctic ice years, similar drought years. So that the bottom line here is we're trying to go through history, and we technically could go back to 1900 or even the late 1800s. But I start right around 1950. Post-World War II, the data is much, much better, and we can do better at that point. So right around 1950 is my cutoff. But the bottom line is analog years are those best fit years that may behave very closely to things we've seen in history. So for your forecast, these are the years. These were the top 19 since 1950. And we don't need to get into the statistical score here on the right, the boxes, but some of your years are 2006, 2001, 2008, 2012, 1999, and it goes on and on and on. But you can see since 1950, the period of weather that we're in right now is most similar to, say, the last 10 to 20 years. That's not coincidence. That's due to other ocean conditions and atmospheric and climate things that we can talk about in the future on another situation. But out of all of these years, I further limit it down to about 5. And in this case, this bottom bullet right here, we've talked through, I run through the statistics, I talk about 1950, but heavy consideration is given to a La Nina fade to neutral for right now. Then a neutral period of the atmosphere this summer, adding influence from El Nino after July. El Nino may technically be here within a month, but the atmosphere, I don't believe, kicks in until about July, when the atmosphere says, okay, we'll be El Nino now. All of those years that I use there are factors in the forecast that we're going to talk about. So the near-term forecast is going to be April through June, the best fit forecast based on history and based on what's happening right now. Right now, we have great snowpack off to the east. The image you have here, that's the snowpack on the ground as of 2 days ago. In centimeters, this area out to the east, out into Quebec, more than 80 centimeters ahead of what's normal for this time of the year is on the ground, waiting to be melted. Depending on the speed of thaw, we do have to worry about the water and flooding potential. But deeper than normal snowpack now, even for the central and west, is going to help our water situation for the spring and early summer. You look at BC, it's basically neutral. Alberta, basically neutral. But Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, deeper than normal snowpack on the ground now will translate with a slow melt that I'm anticipating into boosting our soil moisture, something we haven't had much recently. Now, the fall was great for soil moisture out to the east, good for the wheat before we hit winter. But in a lot of cases, we're still struggling with soil moisture. So on the two images you see here, this is our current soil moisture. Does not consider the snow that's on the ground. Current soil moisture. This is total depth here, so like going down to about 1 to 200 centimeters. No, well, yeah, that would be about right. 1 to 200 centimeters is on the right, and then only the top 1 to 2 centimeters is on the left. And where we have all these reds, terrible soil moisture, that's the west. Where you have kind of the greens and the blues, that's good. That good soil moisture. And that's southern Ontario, southern Quebec did well last fall. In both cases, the soil is still frozen. We can't do anything with that snow sitting there. It's not going to penetrate the soil. So what we need to do is have a slow melt, give that above average snowpack a chance to saturate the soil. These two images for soil moisture that you see should be getting much, much better as we go throughout the thaw. You're going to have better stock water in a lot of cases, better ponds, better stream flow than what we had last year. Better snow situation, even though we have poor soil moisture right now, I do think your surface water supply is going to be better. The forecast for precipitation, April through June, is shown now. Drier areas, they're hit and miss. Wetter areas, they are also hit and miss. The mountainous spots and about half the prairies will have moisture on the way for the spring. So in areas where we melt that snow, try to penetrate the soil a little bit. We're going to need some of that spring moisture, and we'll have some hit and miss pockets of that will be of benefit. Your temperature forecast is advantageous for a slow melt for the west. Prairies, Peace Region, BC, slower melt than normal this year. But we're about to turn the dial on the thermostat. That snowpack to the east is going to be a rapid melt. I anticipate flooding to the east because temperatures April through June rapidly warm up. If you look at them side by side, there's your forecast for the next few months. Rapidly warming to the east, staying cool central and west with hit and miss moisture. Let's turn to the summer. And for this forecast, as I discussed previously, the summer forecast is still kind of a neutral atmosphere, but starting to lean El Nino. And again, El Nino brings our biggest impact in winter and spring, not necessarily summer. So the drawback here for our precip outlook for June through August is drier than average, especially throughout Ontario and Quebec. That's a problem for that snapshot in time. However, we have a lot more snow on the ground than normal for right now. That moisture will help us carry through a drier period ahead. Plus, the soil is already wetter here, and that's going to help us carry us through that dry patch this summer. The prairies, by and large, right around neutral, perhaps slightly wetter than neutral in southern Saskatchewan, Alberta, drier than normal, Manitoba, drier than normal. And also hit and miss moisture out toward BC. Temperatures will be also getting quite hot during this period of time. Without La Nina's influence, we kind of lose that presence of cold. So the growing El Nino influence acts to increase temperatures, not just for the east, but now into the central and now western areas. We'll also be more susceptible to heat waves, rapid onset of heat, record heat kind of things. Coolest areas will remain the far west, and that's a factor of that cold ocean in the Pacific. And again, that we can go 2 hours on that topic in another presentation. But let's get through the forecast side by side for your summer, just so you can compare things. Really, the beneficial water, the super wet areas are going to be well up to the north. Still kind of a dry footprint across areas. But again, the driest areas of summer have a carryover from this winter. Let's look at the best fit forecast for September through November. And this is based on the current best fitting years, based on how I think the atmosphere progresses into an El Nino phase. If it's more rapid, we'll address those changes in the next report that's coming to Canfax next month, but in mid-May. But as you look side by side here for fall, the precipitation forecast is much better right through the center. And we're going to do better for Saskatchewan, parts of Alberta. The dry footprint kind of stays over Ontario and Quebec. Hard to budget. You know, it stays firm. But we're in a good place now, and I hope that carries us over into the late season. Temperature-wise, cooler than average. And that's going to be pretty much a factor for BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So bottom line here is we may see kind of a slower start to our growing season, slower start to planting due to the snow on the ground and a colder than normal forecast. But hey, that's good water for surface and also some of the soil moisture situations for the summer. And then we may see an earlier end to the growing season as a result of getting cooler in the prairies next fall. So a couple of factors there. Now, I know there's going to be a ton of questions. I'll try to answer them when it's appropriate, but there's my contact should you need it if we don't have the time. But that's my time for now, and I hope that gives you a good sense of what created this issue with the drought, what El Nino can bring to the table, and our progression throughout the year ahead. Bottom line, my summary is a more optimistic outlook than we've had, say, the last 3 years going for this year. And not just Canadian industry, but a global industry.